At 73, Miriam Foss opened her mailbox and pulled out a 30-day eviction notice. 30 days to leave the house she'd called home for 2 decades. She stood on that sidewalk afterward with 2 suitcases and nowhere on earth to go. The man who'd done it laughed as he pulled away in his car, certain she'd dissolve into the kind of quiet, invisible erasure he figured women like her deserved. What he never counted on, what nobody in that small Missouri town could have foreseen, was that the rusted shed Miriam would buy for $5 on the edge of town, the one her own children pleaded with her not to waste a cent on, the one the county had nearly condemned twice, held something behind its corroded walls that would shake an entire community and drop that man to his knees. Because what Miriam uncovered inside didn't just alter the course of her life, it built something from nothing. And it proved, permanently, that you should never underestimate a woman standing at the edge of everything with absolutely nothing left to lose. If this story reaches something inside you, make sure you're subscribed. Miriam Foss had lived her whole life as the kind of woman people called dependable. Not glamorous, not ambitious in the way the world tends to applaud, just dependable. Steady as weather turning. The person who arrived without fanfare, handled whatever needed handling, and made sure every soul around her was comfortable, even when she herself was not. She'd grown up in Hannibal, Missouri, youngest daughter of a school teacher father, and a mother who spent 3 decades behind the counter of the family hardware store. Her childhood was modest but full, the kind that teaches you hard work matters and making a fuss about your own needs does not. She carried both lessons her entire life. Sometimes they served her. Sometimes they cost her everything. She married Edgar Foss at 24, a quiet, broad-shouldered electrician who loved her with the same unhurried steadiness he brought to every wire he ever ran. Together, they built a small life in Clover Falls, a rented house on Meridian Road filled with furniture from estate sales, a vegetable garden out back, 2 children who grew into decent adults and then drifted away to their own distant lives. Edgar died 11 years ago, a stroke on a Wednesday morning, so sudden, so final. Miriam didn't fully believe it until the funeral ended and the house fell silent for the first time in decades. She survived his death the way she survived everything. She kept moving, tended her garden, paid her rent faithfully each month from Social Security and the modest savings Edgar had left behind. She visited her neighbors, attended her church, settled into a widowhood that was quiet but not miserable. She wasn't a woman who demanded much from the world. She had what she needed, or so she'd convinced herself. The house on Meridian Road had been rented from the same family for 18 years. The original landlord, a retired schoolteacher named Harold Gentry, was the kind of man who still believed a handshake carried weight. He repaired what broke. He gave fair warning before raising rent. He had known Edgar personally. He treated Miriam with a steady, unspoken respect, and she trusted him without ever needing to name it. She had assumed, without quite forming the words, that she would simply grow old inside those walls. Harold Gentry died on a Sunday in March. By Friday, Miriam had met his nephew. Conrad Whitley was 43, sharp-suited. He'd inherited 3 rental properties in Clover Falls, along with an approach to them that bore no resemblance whatsoever to his uncle's. Conrad believed in market rate adjustments, maximum returns. He believed above everything that sentiment had no place in real estate, and that an elderly widow paying below market rent in a house he could gut, renovate, and flip for serious profit was not a loyal tenant worth protecting. She was, in his calculation, an obstacle. He left the eviction notice in the mailbox on a cold Tuesday morning in November. Didn't ring the bell, didn't knock. Just slid the envelope through and drove off. 30 days. The language was legal and bloodless. Cruelty dressed up as paperwork. Miriam sat at her kitchen table for a long time after she read it, the same table Edgar had dragged home from a neighbor's garage sale 2 decades earlier. The table where her children had scratched through math problems, where she had written every check, lifted every morning cup of coffee, marked every unremarkable day of a life she had loved without ever needing to say so. She called Nathan first. Her son in Tulsa was sympathetic in the rushed manner of a man already measuring the disruption to his own routine. He mentioned the spare room in his house, mentioned it the way people mention things they hope will be declined. She called Sylvia in Cincinnati next. Her daughter carried more warmth, more genuine worry in her voice. But she was also hours away. No room to spare. Sylvia offered money, a small amount, enough for a deposit on something new. She offered it with love, but also with the particular helplessness of a person who cannot think of what else to give. Miriam thanked them both, told them she would figure something out. She was 73 years old. She had no interest in becoming anyone's burden, and she was absolutely not finished yet. The 30 days moved faster than she expected. The first week passed in a kind of suspended disbelief. She walked through her daily routine as though the notice in her mailbox had been some clerical mistake that would correct itself if she simply held still. She watered her plants, she baked a loaf of bread, she sat in Edgar's old armchair beside the window and watched November light bleed out of the afternoons, and told herself there was still time to think. By the second week, she understood there was not. The rental market in Clover Falls bore no resemblance to what it had been when she and Edgar first settled on Meridian Road. The town had shifted in the quiet, incremental way small Midwestern towns sometimes do. A handful of new businesses along the main strip, a couple of subdivisions carved from what used to be farmland, property values climbing in ways that rewarded owners and crushed everyone else. What Miriam had paid Harold Gentry each month, she now understood, was a number that belonged to a different era entirely. The current listings she pulled up on the library computer ran nearly double that figure. Most demanded first and last month's deposit, plus a credit check she was not remotely confident she could pass. She visited 4 apartments during the third week. The first sat on the second floor of a building near the highway. Broken elevator. A landlord who kept calling her underscore, quote, underscore zero, underscore, in a tone that carried no warmth. The second was available immediately because the previous tenant had departed in what appeared to be considerable haste. The smell and the condition of the walls told that story clearly enough. The third was clean and manageable but required 6 months up front. That commitment would have swallowed nearly everything she had saved. The fourth was above a bar, not available until February, which the landlord explained, with genuine helpfulness, was technically only 3 months away. None of them were possible. Miriam told no one this. She drove home after each viewing and made herself a cup of tea and sat with the particular loneliness of a person running the numbers and finding that the numbers will not bend. It was Pete Salazar at the county assessor's office who mentioned the shed, almost as an afterthought. Miriam had gone in to ask about temporary housing assistance programs. That conversation lasted just long enough to confirm such programs existed, and just long enough to establish that the wait list stretched months, not weeks. Pete had worked the front desk for 22 years. He had developed a quiet gift for reading the specific kind of exhaustion worn by people who walked in hoping for help and walked out without it. He paused as Miriam reached for her coat. "There's a parcel out on Rudder Road," he said. "County's had it listed for a while. Old storage structure on a quarter-acre lot. Hasn't sold. I don't think anyone's even asked." Miriam asked how much. Pete glanced at his screen. $5, he said. "Technically just to transfer the deed. Taxes were delinquent for years. County wants it off the books." She asked what was wrong with it. Pete went quiet for a moment. The quiet of a man choosing honesty over comfort. "It's a shed," he said carefully. "Been sitting empty a long time. I wouldn't get your hopes up about the condition." Miriam Foss had not had her hopes up about anything in several weeks. Miriam asked for the address. Rudder Road ran east out of town, past the grain co-op and the old drive-in theater, nothing now but a field of weeds so overgrown that no one alive could remember what it had looked like in use. The quarter-acre lot waited at the end of a gravel track that was barely visible from the road. A rusted county stake marked the boundary. Beside it, a no dumping sign that someone had clearly treated as a suggestion. Miriam parked and walked toward the structure and felt something settle in her chest. Not hope. Not quite. More like the quiet disappearance of surprise. The shed measured roughly 20 feet by 14, metal-sided. Whatever color it had started life as was long gone, buried under layers of rust and oxidation that had pulled everything toward the same deep reddish brown. The roof was corrugated steel, bowed slightly on one end but holding. A single small window on the south-facing wall had been blocked from the inside with cardboard. The door was padlocked. That detail struck Miriam as almost funny, as though something worth protecting lived in there. She stood in the gray November air and looked at it for a long time. Conrad Whitley had laughed when he handed her the eviction notice. Her son had offered a spare room in the voice of a man already tensing for the weight of her. Her daughter had sent money, the helpless kind, the kind people send when they don't know what else their hands can do. And here, at the end of a gravel track past a field of dead weeds, was the only option left that asked nothing of anyone, the one that cost exactly $5. She called Pete at the assessor's office from where she stood on the gravel. "I'll take it," she said. He went quiet. "Ma'am, I want to make sure I was clear. It's just a storage structure. No utilities. I don't even know if the floor is solid." "I understand," Miriam said. "I'll take it." She drove to the county office the next morning and signed the transfer deed. The clerk processed it without ceremony, stamped it twice, slid it back across the counter. Miriam drove home. She finished packing the last of her belongings into her car and into her daughter's old minivan. Sylvia had made the drive up from Cincinnati to help. On the final morning of her 30 days on Meridian Road, Miriam closed the door of the only home she had known as a widow and drove east on Rudder Road. She did not look back. She had $5 in the transaction record. She had a padlock key from the county. She had a quarter-acre of Missouri dirt and a rusted shed that no one had wanted for years. She had no idea yet what she also had. The key was small and brass-colored, worn smooth on the bow from years of handling by whoever had last cared about what was inside. Miriam stood in front of the shed door on that first morning, with her car parked behind her in the cold December air moving low through the dead grass. She held the key for a moment before using it. She was not a superstitious woman. She did not believe in signs or omens or the kind of heavy meaning people assign to ordinary objects in hard moments. She was practical. Her family had been practical. A key was a key. She turned it anyway, with more deliberateness than was strictly necessary, as though the act required her full attention. The padlock released. The door swung outward on hinges that screamed with rust. The smell that came to meet her was layered. Old wood, cold earth, the particular staleness of air that has been sealed away, undisturbed, for a long time. And beneath all of that, something else she could not immediately name. Something almost dry, almost papery, like the inside of an old book. She stepped in. The only light came from the open door behind her and from a pale strip of December sky showing through a gap where the roof met the south wall. She stood still and let her eyes find the room. The floor was wood planking, old, visibly soft in places, covered in a thin skin of grit and what looked like decades of settled dust and debris. The walls were bare metal sheeting, streaked through with oxidation. Along the eastern wall, several wooden shelves ran end to end, empty except for a few rusted coffee tins and a coil of wire so corroded it had fused into a single, solid shape. In the far corner, a wooden workbench sat crooked on uneven legs, one end shimmed up by a folded scrap of tin. This was not a home. It barely qualified as storage. Cold seeped from every surface. The air carried the smell of years, of neglect, of the particular sadness that clings to things left behind without a word of goodbye. Miriam Foss stood in the center of it and gave one single nod. The kind of nod a person gives when reality simply confirms what the body already knew. Then she walked back to the car and got her cleaning supplies. Those first 3 days were about function, not feeling. She swept, she scrubbed, she tore off the cardboard someone had taped across the small window and let pale winter light push through the filthy glass. She sealed the gap along the roofline with a tube of weatherproof caulk from the hardware store in town. She assembled the small camping cot she'd brought, positioned it well clear of the soft spots in the floor, and arranged her essentials with the careful precision of a woman who had chosen survival over comfort. She did not cry. The crying was already behind her. What moved through her now was a kind of concentrated anger, and over the past month, she had learned to burn it as fuel. It was on the 4th day. She'd been working the crowbar under a section of rotted floor planking near the workbench, boards that had started to bow dangerously when she stepped on them. The crowbar caught an edge. The plank came away clean, and beneath it was not the bare Missouri dirt she expected. Beneath it was a seam, a deliberate seam, cut into a precise rectangle, roughly 4 feet by 3, with a recessed iron ring set flush into the wood on one side. A trapdoor. Miriam sat back on her heels and stared. She was not a woman who acted on impulse. She thought things through. She considered the structural integrity of whatever space lay beneath, the possibility of animals nesting down there, the practical question of what use a hidden cellar could actually serve in her present situation. She weighed all of this for approximately 45 seconds. Then she gripped the iron ring and pulled. The trapdoor was heavier than it looked, swollen with old moisture, but not sealed. It resisted, then gave way. All at once. Another wave of that dry, papery smell she'd noticed on her first morning rolled up from below. Stronger now, almost sweet. Beneath the opening was a root cellar, maybe 5 feet deep, roughly the same dimensions as the trapdoor above it. Packed earth walls lined at some earlier time with fitted wooden boards. Dry, remarkably dry given everything above and around it. And stacked inside, wrapped in what looked like muslin cloth tied with cotton cord, bundle upon bundle rising from the earthen floor to just beneath the trapdoor frame, were shapes Miriam recognized even through their wrappings. Quilts. Dozens of them. Carefully, deliberately stored. Preserved as though someone had placed them there with absolute intention, and with every expectation of coming back. Miriam reached down and lifted the nearest bundle. Even through the cloth, she felt its weight, the density of stitching pressed against her palms. Her hands, steady all week through every task she'd forced them to do, began, very slightly, to tremble. She did not yet know what she held, but something in her, some instinct older than logic, understood she was holding something that mattered. She carried the bundles up one at a time, set each one on the workbench in the thin December light filtering through the cleaned window. 31 bundles. She counted twice to be certain, every one wrapped in muslin that had aged to the color of old cream, tied with cotton cord that had dried stiff but refused to rot. Whoever packed these had done it properly. Whoever packed these had wanted them to survive. She opened the nearest bundle first, worked the cord loose with careful fingers, pulled back the muslin layer by layer until the quilt inside lay exposed. She spread it across the workbench as far as the space allowed, stepped back, looked at it, and the breath left her body. The quilt was large, full bed size, perhaps worked in a pattern she recognized dimly from her mother's descriptions of old craft traditions. A complex medallion design radiating outward from a central octagonal block, pieced from dozens of distinct fabric squares in deep indigo, rust, gold, and cream. The stitching was remarkably fine, small, uniform, speaking of mastery and a patience that bordered on something sacred. The fabrics had aged but held together, not fragile, not brittle, surviving. Color had softened across the decades, but refused to surrender into nothing. The whole piece carried weight, not physical weight, but the weight of someone's entire attention poured into cloth. The dim metal shed for a moment felt like a place that mattered. Miriam knew quilts. Her mother had made them, her grandmother before that. She understood the craft well enough to distinguish between something stitched for warmth and something stitched with an entirely different purpose. What lay on that workbench belonged to the second kind. No, it belonged somewhere beyond even that. She unfolded a second bundle, another quilt, equally stunning. A double wedding ring pattern in colors that had no business looking this alive after decades buried underground. A third bundle revealed a log cabin design executed with such geometric precision that the pattern itself seemed to pulse. A fourth held a cathedral windows quilt, each tiny folded window piece stitched with an accuracy that would have demanded a magnifying glass and a devotion Miriam could barely fathom. She sat on her camping cot in the center of the shed. Open bundles surrounded her on every side. She stared at what her hands had uncovered and tried to force her thoughts into order. The first question was obvious. Who had made these? The second, why hide them here, in this cellar, on this forgotten land? The third question arrived more slowly. It crept in as she handled each piece. ran her fingers along each seam. What might these actually be worth? Miriam was no fool when it came to antique textiles. She had watched enough television, the kind with appraisers and estate sale revelations, to understand that handmade quilts of real age and genuine quality could fetch serious money, especially in certain markets, especially when backed by provenance. But she also knew what she was not. She was not an expert. What she believed she was seeing and what was actually spread across that cot could be two entirely different things. She needed knowledge she did not possess. She needed someone who carried that knowledge. The closest town with a library holding reference materials on American folk art and textile history sat 40 minutes down the road. Miriam drove there the next morning. The librarian, a careful, deliberate woman named Cecile, who wore her reading glasses on a beaded chain and had clearly fielded unusual requests before, helped Miriam pull 3 reference volumes on American quilt history. She pointed her toward an online database cataloging documented antique textile sales. Miriam sat at that library table for 4 hours. She filled page after page in the small spiral notebook she had carried in her purse for years. What she found on those pages rearranged everything she thought she understood. The patterns from the cellar, the medallion, the double wedding ring, the log cabin, the cathedral windows, aligned with documented styles from the mid to late 19th century. The fabric compositions, assessed by touch and careful examination, suggested pre-industrial weaving. The stitching density in several quilts matched what the reference texts identified as the work of accomplished makers in the Missouri and Kentucky quilting traditions. Women whose creations had, in documented cases, crossed the auction block at major houses for figures that made Miriam's hands stop writing. Press harder into the page. A single authenticated 19th century Missouri quilt of significant quality had sold at a St. Louis estate auction 3 years earlier for $4,000. A collection of documented works by a known maker had gone for 11 times that figure. Miriam had 31 quilts in a root cellar on Rudder Road. She sat in the library parking lot afterward, did not turn the key. The winter afternoon hung gray and cold around the car, and bare trees along the street bent in a wind she could watch through the glass but could not hear. She thought about Conrad Whitley's eviction notice sitting in the mailbox. She thought about Nathan's spare room, offered in a voice that sounded like obligation, not love. She thought about the county clerk stamping the transfer deed twice without lifting her eyes. $5. She had paid $5 for this land. She turned the ignition, pulled out toward Rudder Road. And for the first time in months, her face held something that had been missing for a very long time. She was smiling. The first person Miriam called was Cecile. Not the obvious choice. Cecile was a librarian. Miriam had met her exactly once. 4 hours spent hunched over reference books, sharing a pot of terrible coffee from the machine by the periodical section. She was not a friend, not yet. But she was the only person Miriam had encountered in recent weeks who had offered help without hesitation. And without that particular look, the one people give a 73-year-old woman on her own, that careful, slightly pitying expression, the one where you can almost watch them doing the math in their heads, calculating how much of a burden she might become. Cecile hadn't looked at her that way. Cecile had looked at her research request the way a person looks at a puzzle worth solving, with energy, not reluctance. Miriam picked up the phone, called the library, asked for Cecile by name. She explained as plainly as she could manage what she had discovered and what she needed. She needed to learn how to authenticate antique quilts. She needed to understand the formal assessment process. She needed to know whether what she held in her hands was genuinely significant or whether she'd spent 4 hours in a library constructing a tower of hope on a foundation made entirely of wishful thinking. Cecile went quiet for a moment after Miriam finished speaking. Then she said, "I know someone you should talk to." That someone was Dr. Anita Voss, a textile historian at the University of Missouri who had devoted 30 years to documenting American folk art traditions. She drove down to Clover Falls on a Saturday morning 3 weeks later, her car packed with reference binders and a magnifying loop she wore around her neck like a pendant. She was in her 60s, brisk and warm in equal measure. She walked into the shed on Rudder Road, by then considerably cleaner, considerably more organized. Miriam had spent the intervening weeks making it as presentable as a rusted metal structure on a gravel lot could reasonably become. Dr. Voss stepped in front of the first quilt Miriam had spread across the workbench and said nothing for almost 2 full minutes. Then, "Where did you get these?" It was not a question. It was the sound of someone recalibrating everything she thought she knew. Miriam told her the whole story. The eviction, the $5 deed, the padlock key, the trapdoor hidden beneath the rotted floor. Dr. Voss listened without interrupting, her magnifying loupe already traveling slowly across the surface stitching of the medallion quilt. When Miriam finished, Dr. Voss looked up with an expression that was carefully professional, but unable to fully conceal what churned beneath it. "This stitching pattern," she said, "is consistent with documented work from the Missouri River Valley tradition, approximately 1870 to 1890. The fabric composition in this central medallion block, this is a pre-commercial dye, almost certainly natural indigo. You do not find natural indigo in quilts made after about 1885 in this region." She moved to the second bundle. "May I?" Miriam nodded. Dr. Voss opened 4 more quilts over the next hour. She examined each with the loupe and with her bare hands, turned edges, studied backing seams, held sections up to the light that fell through the window. She photographed everything, made notes in a small leather journal. She spoke little while she worked, and Miriam, who had learned long ago when to let silence do its job, did not fill it. When she finished, Dr. Voss lowered herself into the folding chair Miriam had placed beside the workbench, removed the loop from around her neck, looked at Miriam directly. "I cannot give you a formal appraisal today," she said. "That requires documentation, provenance research, a certified process, and I can refer you to one. But I can tell you what I believe I am looking at." She paused. "I believe several of these quilts are the work of a single maker, or possibly 2 makers working in close collaboration, in the Missouri River Valley tradition, dating to the 1870s or 1880s. The consistency of stitching across multiple pieces is remarkable. The preservation is extraordinary. Whoever stored these understood exactly what they were doing. And the quality of the work itself is, in my professional opinion, exceptional. Not merely good, exceptional." Miriam asked the question she had carried for 3 weeks, the one she'd held between her ribs like a breath she was afraid to release. __quote _19 _ Dr. Voss offered the number carefully. "The way you hand someone something that might shatter." "Quote 20, quote," she said. "Quote 21, quote." She offered a range of figures. The low end of that range stopped Miriam's hands where they rested in her lap. The high end transformed the shed around her into some place she had never been before. After Dr. Voss left, Miriam sat by herself for a long while. Outside, winter light was draining from the sky. Wind pushed through the dead grass on the lot, a dry whisper against nothing. She found herself thinking about the woman who had stitched these quilts, whoever she had been, bent over fabric in the lamplight of some Missouri farmhouse that no longer existed, with no way of knowing that 150 years later, a 73-year-old widow would pull her life's work from the earth and be held up by it. Miriam stayed with that woman in her mind for a very long time. Then she reached for her notebook and began making a plan. Authentication consumed 4 months. Dr. Voss connected Miriam with Raymond Chu, a certified textile appraiser based in Kansas City. He drove out to Rudder Road in February, an assistant riding alongside him, and the 2 of them spent an entire day photographing, cataloging, and scrutinizing each of the 31 quilts with a precision Miriam found both comforting and faintly unnerving, the way any careful process becomes unnerving when the stakes are too high for casualness. Raymond spoke little during the examination itself. He communicated mostly through involuntary sounds, small notes of admiration escaping him like breath, sounds he seemed barely aware he was making. 3 weeks later, he called with preliminary findings. "Quote 22, he told her. "Quote 23, he said, his voice deliberate. "Quote 24. He delivered the formal appraisal numbers. Miriam copied them into her spiral notebook with the same steady handwriting she had used for grocery lists across 4 decades. When she finished, she set the pen down. She sat perfectly still in the folding chair beside her workbench, breathed slowly, waited for the pressure in her chest to settle into something she could carry. The total appraised value of the collection was $214,000. She was 73 years old. She was living in a shed on a gravel lot at the edge of a small Missouri town, and beneath her floor had lain a fortune. She did not rush toward any decision. That was never how she operated. Instead, she spent the weeks that followed doing what she had always done when something important required thinking through. She worked while she thought. She kept improving the shed, installed a proper wood stove with a flue that Raymond's assistant had helped her track down, tore out the worst of the floor planking, and replaced it with solid oak boards, sanded them herself, sealed them herself, cut a second window into the north wall for better light. Her hands had become something almost foreign to her, calloused and sure, the hands of a person who built things rather than simply kept them from falling apart. Cecile drove out on weekends to help. Their friendship had deepened the way friendships sometimes do when they start in practical necessity and discover, somewhere amid shared labor and honest talk, that they have quietly become something more. Cecile brought food and reference materials and her own particular kind of clear-eyed encouragement, the kind that never drifted into hollow comfort. She was the first person Miriam told about the appraisal figures. Her response, a long silence followed by a single very quiet expletive entirely unlike her, was exactly what the moment required. The story of what Miriam had uncovered could have stayed quiet, held close by the small handful of people who knew. But then there was Gloria Park. Gloria wrote a weekly column for the regional paper out of Jefferson City. Doctor. Voss had mentioned the authenticated quilt collection in a university newsletter piece about significant folk art discoveries in Missouri. That mention reached Gloria, and Gloria reached for the phone. She called Miriam in March, asked if she'd be willing to talk. Miriam sat with the question for 2 days before she said yes. The article ran on a Thursday in April. The headline read, quote, 25 __. Gloria told Miriam's story plainly, without embellishment, and that turned out to be more than enough. The eviction, the deed, the trapdoor, the quilts, the appraisal. Within 48 hours, 3 regional outlets had picked it up. One national lifestyle publication ran a condensed version under a different headline that Miriam found slightly overwrought, but didn't object to, because the attention it generated was beyond anything she could have predicted. Her phone didn't stop ringing for a week. Collectors called, museum curators called, a documentary filmmaker called twice. But then, in the evenings, after the professional inquiries had gone quiet, a different kind of call came through. Women. Women who had lived their own versions of what Miriam had lived through. Those were the calls she stayed on longest. Sometimes an hour, sometimes longer. Talking to strangers who weren't quite strangers, because they spoke a language she understood completely. It was during the second week after the article that Conrad Whitley appeared on Rudder Road. Miriam was outside when his car came up the gravel track, a newer model than the one she remembered. It moved slowly, with a visible hesitation about whether the track would be adequate for its clearance. She was transplanting seedlings into the raised bed she'd built along the south wall of the shed. She did not stand up, did not move toward him. She waited. He got out of the car looking smaller than she remembered. Not physically, he was still the same broad-shouldered man in the same category of expensive coat. But something had compressed in him, something that suggested the months since November had not been uncomplicated. He looked at the shed, the new window, the repaired roof, the raised garden bed, the neat gravel path Miriam had laid from the road to the door. His expression moved through several things before settling on something she could not immediately name. "Mrs. Voss," he said. "Mr. Whitley," she said. She did not put down her trowel. He told her he'd read the article. She said nothing. He told her he hadn't realized the property held any value when it was transferred to her by the county, that if he had known there was anything of significance there, he would naturally have, and here he paused, recalibrating his sentence mid-construction. Miriam waited patiently for him to land somewhere. He landed on the word partnership. There was, he explained, potentially a legal question about whether a property sold by the county for back taxes might carry certain claims related to items discovered within it. His understanding was that found property on a purchased lot was a complex area. He had spoken to someone, not quite a lawyer, his tone suggested, but adjacent to one, who believed there might be grounds for a conversation about shared interest in the collection's value. A percentage, a reasonable arrangement between reasonable people. Miriam set down her trowel then, not because she needed her hands free, because she wanted to give him her full attention when she said what she was about to say. She told him that the deed to the property had been transferred to her cleanly and legally by the county of Missouri. She told him she had consulted with an actual lawyer 3 weeks prior, the first thing she'd done after the article ran and the calls began, and that the collection was unambiguously hers. She told him that the word partnership was an interesting choice for a man who had communicated with her exclusively through a mailbox slot, who had not spoken a single word to her face in the 18 years she had paid his Uncle Harold Gentry reliable rent. She told him she wished him well, and she meant it. His misfortune was nothing she wanted weighing on her conscience. But this conversation was finished. Conrad Whitley stood on Rudder Road just long enough for the silence to turn awkward. Then he climbed back into his car and drove away. Miriam picked up her trowel, went back to her seedlings. The first quilt sold in May. A private collector in Chicago, a woman who had spent 30 years acquiring significant American folk textiles, reached out through Raymond Chu, roughly 2 weeks after the article appeared. She was precise, knowledgeable, and did not try to negotiate beneath the appraised value. Miriam had already decided she would not accept less than that figure. No amount of pressure would have moved her. The collector arrived on a Tuesday afternoon to examine the medallion quilt in person. She asked 3 sharp technical questions, the kind that proved she understood exactly what hung before her. That same afternoon, she wrote a check. At the door of the shed, she shook Miriam's hand and said, with what seemed like genuine feeling, that this was one of the finest pieces she had acquired in a decade. Miriam deposited the check the following morning. Then she sat in her car in the bank parking lot, not moving, not thinking really, just letting it settle into her bones, the reality of what had happened, what her own hands had uncovered. Over the months that followed, 9 more quilts found homes. 2 went to private collectors. 1 traveled to a folk art gallery in Nashville, where they built a small exhibition around it and sent Miriam a photograph. Her quilt hanging on a clean white wall under proper museum lighting, framed by an explanatory card that told the story in 3 careful paragraphs: the shed, the trapdoor, the $5 deed. 3 were acquired by the State Historical Society of Missouri. Dr. Anita Voss helped Miriam navigate those negotiations, and the final figure came in considerably above the individual appraised values. The society understood they were not simply purchasing objects. They were acquiring a documented fragment of regional cultural history. The remaining 3 sold through an estate auction house in St. Louis that Raymond had recommended. The sale drew bidders from 6 states and generated a brief wave of attention in the kind of publications that covered such things. The 14 quilts Miriam kept, she had decided early which ones were not for sale at any price. 4 of them were museum-grade pieces. She held them not because she had calculated their maximum value and was waiting for a better offer. She held them because they belonged to whoever had made them. And since that woman was long gone, could never receive them back, the closest thing to honoring her was keeping them together, intact, whole. The other 10 she kept because she was not finished deciding what to do with them, and because she had learned at 73 that patience was not the same thing as delay. What the sales gave her, beyond the money itself, was foundation. She turned that word over in her mind often during those months. It meant exactly what she needed it to mean. Not just financial security, though it was that. Something more structural, a base from which to stand upright, not a constant scramble to keep from falling. For the first time since Edgar had died, and honestly for the first time in years before that, Miriam Foss was not managing scarcity. She was building something. She started with the shed, not because she had to. She could have rented an apartment now, could have moved somewhere with running water already installed, floors that did not require her personal labor. But the shed was hers in a way that went deeper than the deed in her name. It was the place that had demanded her full self at the exact moment she had nearly forgotten she still had one. Walking away from it would have betrayed everything the previous months had taught her. She hired Dwayne, a local contractor who had done solid work for a neighbor Cecile knew. For 3 months, Miriam worked alongside him. She learned what she could, delegated what she couldn't. Together, they converted the structure into something that was still recognizably itself. The metal bones, the corrugated roof, The plain geometry of a working building, but now insulated, plumbed, wired, genuinely livable. She kept the original workbench. She kept the trapdoor. She'd fitted it with proper hinges and a new ring pole, and now it covered the root cellar she had scrubbed clean and lined with real shelving, sturdy enough to hold the 14 quilts she was keeping. The oak floor she had laid herself during the winter, she refinished until it came up warm and solid beneath the natural light pouring through 2 windows. Her mother's kitchen table went against the east wall, under the north window. By September, Miriam had a home. Not the home she had lost. Something different. Something that carried her fingerprints in the most literal sense. She had constructed it with her own hands, a fact that still caught her off guard when she sat quietly and considered it. She had been a woman who paid rent and tended a garden, and trusted that stability grew from continuity. Now she was a woman who understood that stability could also be built, that it did not need to be inherited or granted or preserved from some earlier chapter. That you could make it from nothing, even at 73, even from a $5 shed on a gravel lot at the end of a road nobody bothered to drive down. Her children visited in October. Nathan flew in from Tulsa and stood in the doorway of the converted shed. He looked around with an expression that shifted slowly from disbelief to something unmistakably like pride, though it took him a moment to locate that feeling inside himself. Sylvia sat at the kitchen table and wept quietly, then laughed at herself for weeping. Miriam made coffee. They sat together in the afternoon light and talked the way they had not talked in years, honestly, without the careful distance that had built up between them since Edgar died, without the particular awkwardness of a mother who was supposed to need her children and children who could not figure out how to give what was needed. Nathan said, "Mom, I should have come sooner." Miriam said, "You're here now." Then Cecile arrived, carrying a bottle of wine and a pan of cornbread. The 4 of them sat at the table Edgar had hauled from a neighbor's garage sale 20 years before, the table that had survived the eviction and the move and the long winter on Rudder Road. They ate. They talked until the light outside was gone and the Missouri stars had come out in full. Miriam looked around at all of it. The quilts on the wall, the oak floor, the window she had cut with her own hands, the people she loved and the people she had found. And she felt something she recognized, finally, as joy. Not relief, not survival, joy. The distinction mattered enormously. 2 years after Miriam Foss had signed a transfer deed for $5 and driven east on Rudder Road with everything she owned packed into a car and a borrowed minivan, she stood before a room full of women at the Clover Falls Community Center. She did not entirely recognize the life she was describing as her own, not because it felt foreign, because it felt more genuinely hers than anything she had lived before it. The community center event had been Cecile's idea, organized under the modest banner of a gathering for women over 60 in the region who were navigating transitions, divorce, widowhood, displacement, the particular invisibility that seemed to descend on women past a certain age like a weather system nobody had warned them about. 43 women came. Some drove more than an hour. They sat in folding chairs with coffee cups in their hands and the careful expressions of people hoping to hear something true. Miriam told them the truth. She told them about the eviction notice in the mailbox, the 4 apartments that were not possible, the conversation with Pete Salazar at the county assessor's office that had lasted less than 5 minutes and rearranged everything. She told them about the padlock key and the smell of old paper and the trapdoor and the 31 bundles wrapped in muslin cloth that had been waiting underground longer than she had been alive. She told them about the appraisal figures and the article, and Conrad Whitley standing on the gravel track. She told them about building a floor and cutting a window and discovering at 73 that her hands were capable of things she had never once asked them to do. She told them about the woman who had made the quilts, because in the months since the discovery, Miriam had pursued that question with the same patient thoroughness she had brought to everything else. Working with Dr. Anita Voss, and a local historian, had traced the property records backward through the county archives. And what they uncovered was this. The shed and the lot on Rudder Road had belonged in the 1870s and 1880s to a woman named Beulah Crane, a freedwoman who had settled in central Missouri after